Several years back, something quite unusual happened involving one of my closest friends. I was around 16 years old. One evening, I decided to spend the night at my friend's place. After watching a series of horror films, we felt like embarking on a little adventure. Not far from his house stood a derelict building complex slated for demolition, a cluster of abandoned structures in terrible disrepair scheduled to be torn down the very next day by the local authorities to make way for new residential units. The entire site was cordoned off with chain-link fencing, and signs explicitly forbidding entry were posted everywhere. The access points to the buildings had been sealed with wooden boards. Entrances and window frames were completely blocked off, making entry impossible. We decided to explore the old area and snap a few random pictures. My friend knew a way to get onto the site. As we approached, we saw that every entrance was securely boarded, just as we expected, preventing access. However, we noticed one building with an upper-level window that hadn't been sealed particularly well. We could clearly see into the room. We captured a photo of it using a camera on a mobile phone. Later, we returned home and looked through the images we had taken. Suddenly, we paused at the picture of that window. Inside, we saw a figure. A woman wearing a dark overcoat with pale skin and dark hair that hung quite long. As far as we could discern, the woman appeared deeply unhappy. We hadn't seen anyone up there when we took the shot, and furthermore, the windows and doors were supposed to be boarded. We went back to the location to double-check. Upon inspection, everything was indeed tightly sealed, and there was no woman to be found inside. This account isn't my personal experience, rather it belongs to a friend of mine from overseas. I'll refer to him as Leo. This occurred when Leo was just around 12 or 13 years old. Leo was quite a good-looking kid and attracted a good amount of attention. One particular girl, however, developed an intense fixation. I'll call her Yuki. Yuki was significantly older than Leo, about 18. She was an acquaintance of Leo's and resided just down the street from him. Leo hadn't really given her much thought until she began consistently shadowing him day and night. She would follow him relentlessly, whether in person or via electronic means. Leo first started getting a bad feeling when she began sending him dozens of messages daily. Things like, "Stay safe," "Are you okay?" "Sleep well," and so on. This seemed a bit odd, but he initially dismissed it. Then the communications grew progressively more unsettling. Instead of simple check-ins, her messages became disturbingly personal. Comments like, "You really should eat your midday meal if he happened to skip lunch," or "I think your little sister is feeling hungry," when his younger sibling was upset. Leo stopped using his phone and social media accounts at this point, but that wasn't the end of it. Leo's mother was rarely home, so he often had caregivers look after him. One day, he arrived home to find a new babysitter. It was Yuki. There was nothing overtly peculiar about how she cared for him and his siblings that day. But he felt she was cultivating a closeness with his mother that made him uncomfortable. One day at school, Yuki approached Leo and informed him that his mother would be away from the country for a week and had asked her to have Leo stay at her place. Leo felt hesitant initially, but well, if it was his mother's wish, he couldn't object. Yuki told him his mother had already departed, so he should go home with her after class that afternoon. Leo reluctantly agreed and accompanied her back to her residence. When they arrived, her parents weren't there. Things become somewhat unclear at this point as my friend becomes emotional recounting the story. Still visibly shaken by it today. He mentioned that Yuki would engage him in unsettling games. Things like playing family, where she adamantly insisted she was the wife and he was the husband. Also games resembling cops and robbers and contests to see who would get frightened first, which involved her blindfolding him and leaving him isolated in a silent space for extended periods. About 5 days into his stay at her house, Yuki left for her part-time employment. She had secured the exits and the windows were too high to attempt an escape. So he remained parked in front of the television. There he saw a disturbing news bulletin. It was a report about a missing juvenile, the missing child being himself. Before he could even manage to note the contact number, the television screen went blank, and Yuki was standing directly behind him, holding the remote control. Leo panicked, crying and shouting. Yuki tried to hold him, but he managed to wriggle free from her grasp just in time to force open an upper window and call out for help. Fortunately for him, a couple passing by below heard his shouts and contacted the authorities. Within roughly 60 minutes, the police arrived and discovered him confined within her private room, blindfolded, and with his hands bound. As Yuki was still below the age of majority, Leo isn't certain of the specific outcome of her case. He only recalls seeing the officers escorting her away while his mother embraced him tightly. He relocated to a different country shortly after this event and has not encountered his abductor since. But the mere mention of her identifier still causes him distress. Roughly half a decade ago, I resided in the urban core of a large American city. I've always been someone who stays up late, so I often found myself bored after my flatmate, who preferred early nights, had gone to sleep. To occupy my time, I used to embark on lengthy strolls, using the opportunity to reflect. I spent around 4 years doing this, walking alone late at night, and never once felt unsafe. I used to joke with my companions that even the street peddlers in the city were courteous. But all that changed dramatically in the space of just a few moments one evening. It was a midweek night, probably between 1 and 2 a.m., and I was walking near a public garden regularly patrolled by law enforcement, a fair distance from my dwelling. It was an unusually quiet night, even for a weekday, with very little vehicular movement and hardly anyone on foot. The park, typical of most nights, was completely empty. I turned down a short side road intending to circle back towards my apartment. That's when I first became aware of him. At the far end of the lane on my side, I saw the shape of a person swaying. It was a peculiar movement, somewhat resembling a formal dance, but he concluded each turn with a forward inclination, like a step. You could perhaps describe it as a dancing walk, advancing directly toward me. Assuming he was likely intoxicated, I moved as close to the edge of the pavement as possible to grant him ample space to pass. As he drew nearer, I became increasingly aware of the strange fluidity of his motions. He was quite tall and thin, dressed in an outdated suit. He continued his dancing walk closer until I could distinguish his features. His eyes were wide open and seemed wild, his head tilted back slightly, gazing upwards. His mouth was stretched into an unnaturally broad, almost caricatured grin. The combination of his eyes and that smile convinced me to move to the opposite side of the street before he got any closer. I averted my gaze from him briefly to cross the deserted roadway. As I reached the other side, I glanced back and immediately stopped rigid. He had ceased his movement and was now standing still, one foot positioned on the road surface, perfectly aligned with my position. He was facing in my direction, but still staring towards the sky, the wide grin still fixed on his lips. I felt completely and utterly unnerved by this. I resumed walking, but kept my focus on the individual. He remained motionless. Once I had placed approximately half a city block between us, I looked away for an instant to observe the path in front of me. The street and sidewalk ahead were still entirely deserted. Still feeling uneasy, I looked back to his previous location to find he was no longer there. For the briefest moment, I felt a sense of relief until I spotted him again. He had crossed the street and was now slightly crouched down. I couldn't be entirely certain due to the separation and the shadows, but I was convinced he was looking towards me. I had only looked away from him for perhaps 10 seconds at most, so it was clear he had moved with surprising speed. I was so taken aback that I simply stood there for a while staring at him. Then he began to advance towards me again. He took enormous, exaggerated, tiptoed strides, as if he were a cartoon character sneaking up on someone, except he was progressing very, very rapidly. At this point, I'd like to claim that I fled, or deployed my defensive spray, or grabbed my cellular device, or did anything at all. But I did nothing. I remained frozen, rooted to the spot as the smiling man crept closer. And then he stopped again, perhaps the length of a car away from me, still smiling, still looking upwards. When I finally managed to find my voice, the first thing that entered my mind simply came out. What I intended to articulate was something akin to, "What in hell do you want?" delivered with a commanding and angry tone. What emerged was a quiet, shaky utterance. "What the—" Regardless of whether or not one can literally detect fear via scent, they can certainly perceive it in vocalization. I heard it in my own voice, which only amplified my terror, but he displayed no reaction whatsoever. He just stood there, maintaining his smile. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he turned around very slowly and began his dancing walk away just as before. Unwilling to expose my back to him again, I simply observed him depart until he was distant enough to be nearly out of sight. And then I realized something crucial: he was no longer moving away. Nor was he performing his dancing walk. I watched in horror as his receding shape grew larger once more. He was returning. He was coming back my way, and this time he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off the side lane and back onto a main artery with better illumination and occasional traffic. Glancing behind me, he was nowhere to be seen. For the remainder of my journey home, I kept casting quick looks over my shoulder, constantly anticipating the sight of that eerie grin. But he never materialized. I remained living in that urban area for 6 additional months after that night, and I never ventured out for another late-night walk. There was something about his countenance that stayed with me. He didn't appear intoxicated. He didn't seem under the influence of anything. He looked completely and utterly deranged. And that is an intensely frightening thing to witness. In the period of the mid-1980s, my mother worked as a residential cleaner in Australia. She would clean properties in developed suburban zones and occasionally took jobs in more rural or agricultural areas known for wine production. She advertised her services by leaving business cards at local retail outlets, which brought in the majority of her clients, along with some referrals and informal recommendations. One day, she received a call from a woman whose voice suggested she was in her late 50s or early 60s, requesting my mother clean her historic farm residence. The lady made a number of peculiar conditions. Typically, my mother would meet potential clients face-to-face before accepting a new assignment. In this specific instance, the woman declined to meet and stated she would leave the entrance keys concealed beneath the primary doormat. My mother agreed, primarily because the client was clearly affluent and was offering significantly more compensation than my mother would reasonably expect. My mother drove out to the property on a Monday morning. She later recounted feeling uneasy from the moment she turned onto the long access road. The dwelling was essentially situated in the center of a very large, isolated parcel of land. She located the keys as instructed and commenced her cleaning work. Roughly 60 minutes into the job, she heard a sound, the rear entry shutting firmly. My mother had been told explicitly that the house would be empty, so she immediately felt insecure. She stood rigid in the kitchen area for what she estimated felt like 3 or 4 minutes, though she admitted it couldn't have been that long in reality. There was no other vehicle present on the premises. She wanted to depart instantly, but had 2 remaining rooms left to finish, both bedrooms. She said that as moments passed and she heard no further disturbances, she decided perhaps it was nothing or something had simply fallen, and it hadn't been the door after all. She cautiously moved down the hallway and stepped into one of the bedrooms. Spread across the bedspread were numerous photographs printed in full color. As my mother drew nearer, she realized the images were all of her. Some appeared to have been captured near our own family home, while others were taken at various houses my mother had been hired to clean. Several looked like they were shot through transparent surfaces or over perimeter barriers. She used the landline phone in the house to contact emergency services and then immediately drove to the far end of the property's driveway. The lady who hired her was subsequently investigated by the authorities, but persistently maintained that the house had been intruded upon by someone else. After some time, the police discontinued their inquiries into the matter, and our family ended up relocating to a different town 4 months later. I'm 21 years old, and this event occurred about 18 months ago. I had just moved into my first independent living space and was in the process of settling in. The main access door to my dwelling unit automatically locks when closed, so I went down to the building's entrance lobby to retrieve my postal mail, while simultaneously talking on my mobile phone with a friend. I returned to the apartment and sat on the mattress while opening the mail. While still using the phone, I accidentally dropped it, and it landed beneath the bed frame. This necessitated me lying on the floor and extending my arm to reach it. As I did, I noticed something that caught my eye. There was an individual hidden beneath my bed, My eyes widened, and I stifled the urge to scream aloud. The person under my bed was lying motionless, with their back facing me and their head lowered towards their chest, so I couldn't see their face, and crucially, they didn't see me. Trying to think clearly despite the rush of frantic thoughts, I picked up my phone and said, "Apologies, I dropped my phone. I'm just going to take a quick wash and call you back." The shower room is situated right beside my sleeping area, so I hurried into it, quietly secured the door, turned on the shower tap, climbed out my window, and immediately dialed the police. They instructed me to remain in the vicinity, but advised me to position myself across the street to observe if anyone exited the building's main entrance. This was during the summer period, and it was still light outside. I positioned myself opposite the building, concealing myself behind a stationary vehicle, watching both my open bathroom window and the building's main doorway. I contacted my friend, and he arrived just before the police did. I handed them my keys, and they entered the dwelling. Only moments later, 2 law enforcement officers emerged, escorting a thin, weary-looking individual. His gaze seemed wild, but he made no attempt to resist or flee. One of the officers stood beside me, offering reassurance while the other police personnel conducted a search of my residence. He informed me that the man had been standing just outside my shower room door holding one of my kitchen knives, seemingly waiting for me to emerge. This person had somehow slipped into my apartment when I was briefly downstairs collecting my mail and had then hidden beneath my bed. The individual who had intended to harm me turned out to be someone without a permanent residence and was subsequently admitted to a psychiatric facility. When I was 21 years of age, my significant other and I were staying overnight at my family's recreational trailer. It was during a winter weather event involving heavy snow, and we were seated on the sofa near the heating unit, cuddling and watching television programs late at night. We were surrounded by nothing but dense woodland in every direction, and the only thing separating us from the outdoors was a timber door with a faulty locking mechanism. The previous time my grandparents visited, my grandfather had placed a few concrete blocks near the entrance to serve as a temporary barricade, given that the door opened inwards anyway. While we were watching TV, my partner began shaking me, insisting she heard something outside. I attempted to reassure her, suggesting it was most likely wildlife like a deer or bear or something similar. But then approximately 5 minutes later, my partner looked at me again, and this time I heard it too. I silenced the television so we could listen more intently. It sounded like someone was tampering with something inside the small outdoor storage shed where the lawnmower was kept. My vehicle was parked outside, and all the internal lights of the trailer were illuminated. If there was anyone outside, they were aware we were inside. My partner was strongly urging me to venture out and investigate, but I told her she must be out of her mind to think I would go outside. The noise ceased, and the only sound was the wind and snow of the storm outside. After a few minutes had passed and the silence held, I felt it might be safe to turn off the interior lights, open the window covering slightly, and take a brief look outside. However, it was too dark to discern anything clearly. I switched on the exterior porch illumination and this allowed me to see a significant portion of the area immediately in front of the trailer. There were impressions in the snow, not animal tracks. They were clearly human footprints, and they were leading in the direction of the rear of the property. I moved to open the draperies on the window overlooking the backyard, and when I did, I felt the urge to scream, but my partner's scream was louder. Even though there were no lights illuminating the backyard area, we could distinctly see a male figure dressed entirely in dark clothing and wearing a distinctive mask standing facing our window. I instantly pulled the blind shut again and instructed my partner to conceal herself in the sleeping quarters while I retrieved my grandfather's hunting firearm from the storage space. I pushed the concrete blocks and several other bulky items against the entrance to create a stronger barrier, secured all the blinds and extinguished the lights, and went to hide with my partner in a far corner of the bedroom. Suddenly, there was a forceful impact at the main entrance. He was attempting to force the door open. I don't even think he bothered trying the handle, but it wouldn't have mattered in any case. After a few unsuccessful attempts to breach the door, it seemed the individual finally gave up. I remained awake the entire night, the weapon at my side, while my partner eventually fell asleep. We gathered our belongings and departed first thing in the morning. But one unsettling discovery was a fresh set of shoe prints leading from the front yard window area, heading directly into the woods. I haven't returned to that place since, but my grandparents have, and they reported no indications of a break-in or anything being taken. I have no intention of ever going back there. Back when my maternal grandparent was still alive, I would consistently walk the short distance to her residence every day to assist with various household tasks. There was one particular day when I walked over to her place at my usual time and decided to let myself inside. I was surprised to find the door unlocked. She was a very cautious, elderly woman and typically kept everything secured. I noticed her sleeping area entrance was slightly ajar upstairs, and I could hear sounds of someone opening and closing containers and storage units within. I ascended the staircase, calling out "Grandma," and as I was approximately 5 feet from her room's entrance, she abruptly closed her bedroom door with force. I knocked on the door, asking if everything was all right. At that very moment, my mobile phone began to vibrate. The incoming call was from my grandmother's number. I was utterly bewildered, but answered the call anyway. My grandmother was on the other end, instructing me not to visit that day as she was in the process of walking over to her group for older adults. My heart seized up as she conveyed this information. I disconnected the call before she could say anything further, remaining silent myself. I understood exactly what was happening. I decided to feign ignorance and replied, "Grandma, I'll be downstairs," and made my way to my grandmother's food preparation area to retrieve a culinary knife and dial emergency services. Silence persisted from the upstairs bedroom after my conversation. The police arrived shortly after and breached the bedroom entrance. The loud, sudden report of a firearm discharge caught me off guard. When the medical personnel arrived and wheeled out the individual on a gurney, I recognized the man's face. It was the person who lived next door to my grandmother. Apparently, he had observed my grandmother leave her house and had forced entry to search for valuable items. When the police entered the bedroom, they found the man concealed beside the entranceway, armed with a substantial bladed tool. Had I walked into that room, I would have been in grave danger. The most disturbing memory of my entire life involves my wife and me returning to our residence after having dinner out. As soon as we exited our vehicle, we noticed that the front entry door to our house was ajar. I instructed my wife to wait outside while I quickly entered the house and proceeded directly upstairs to the bedroom where I kept a protective rifle. I loaded the firearm and methodically checked every room on the upper level. There was no indication of anyone being present. I then made my way downstairs, scanning the main floor, followed by the basement area. Again, there was no sign of any intruder, and nothing appeared to be missing or displaced. I contacted law enforcement. When they arrived, I explained the situation, and they began their investigation, starting with some rooms upstairs, then moving to the basement. Nothing out of the ordinary was found. They made a point of asking us if we were absolutely certain that we had closed and secured the door when we left. I myself was starting to have lingering doubts, not entirely positive if I had indeed done so. But my wife remained steadfastly convinced that she had closed the door. The police seemed confident that if someone had broken in, they hadn't lingered, as there were no clear signs of theft. My wife was deeply distressed, crying and expressing her discomfort with being inside the house. I did my best to comfort her, assuring her that whoever had entered the house must have departed quickly. I finally managed to fall asleep after hours of restlessness in bed, but my slumber was abruptly interrupted by my wife's piercing scream. I looked over at her, and she was staring intensely towards the storage space near the bed. It struck me suddenly like a physical blow. I had forgotten to check the secondary storage area. I looked towards it and saw, for the briefest fraction of a second, a person's head emerging from the storage door before it was quickly pulled back inside and the door closed. Within 5 seconds, I had the rifle loaded and in my grasp, and I chambered around to signal to the intruder that I was armed. I yelled for him to come out, and just like that, the storage door opened. But instead of indicating submission, he made a frantic dash towards the main entrance of the house. I could have used the weapon, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. He was never apprehended. He evaded capture entirely. I truly believe having that defensive tool prevented a terrible outcome for us. Approximately a year ago, while still living in my parents' dwelling, I began experiencing some peculiar occurrences within the house, specifically within my sleeping quarters. While lying awake in my bed late one evening, I detected a faint sound originating from the far side of the room. A slow, deliberate creaking noise. My wardrobe door had inexplicably come open. When I arose to investigate, I automatically checked inside the wardrobe for anyone hidden, even though I was 26 years old. Of course, there was nobody present, so I shut the door firmly and returned to bed. Later that same night, I heard low, rumbling, vibrating sounds coming from overhead, within the ceiling space. It sounded as though something was moving within the ventilation ducts. It was a very odd noise. I genuinely had no idea what to make of it, but as soon as it stopped, I rather quickly put it out of my mind and drifted off to sleep. The following morning, I did mention the sounds in the ceiling area the previous night to my father, but annoyingly, he didn't seem particularly interested, or perhaps he simply didn't take me very seriously. That night, I was again lying awake in my bed, contemplating various things, when once more the slow creak of the wardrobe door slowly opening broke the stillness. This time I felt genuinely apprehensive. I knew the door had been completely shut and properly latched. It would require someone twisting the handle to be able to push it open. This time I conducted an extra thorough examination inside the wardrobe for any hidden person. Even though it wasn't a large storage space and there really wasn't anywhere someone could realistically conceal themselves, I attempted to rationalize it as a malfunction with the door mechanism or something similar. And that same night I again heard the vibrating sounds emanating from above the ceiling. It was precisely the same sequence of events as the night before. The next morning, I finally persuaded my father to examine my wardrobe door. However, he quickly concluded that the door was functioning correctly when closed. He tested the handle and it showed no signs of coming unlatched. Naturally, he suggested that I was simply neglecting to fully close the door, but I was certain that I was not. That night I remained seated, waiting for it to happen again. And right on schedule, the wardrobe door slowly creaked open. I waited for the sounds from above the ceiling, but there was only a prolonged silence. I switched on my bedside lamp and looked up towards the air grill in my room. And I cried out at the top of my capacity. I could clearly discern two wide, open eyes peering down at me through the vent. My parents burst into my room, demanding to know if I had lost my mind. I explained the entire sequence of events, and they exchanged glances as if I had completely become detached from reality. Unsurprisingly, they dismissed my account, attributing it to a dream or the fact that I was overly tired and imagining things. They even proceeded to lecture me about staying awake too late. But to this day, I remain certain that I did not conjure it up. It felt too real. Regarding the regular opening of the wardrobe, I know for a fact that this was not a product of my imagination. I have never been a proponent of supernatural beliefs, but I still have absolutely no other coherent explanation for those 3 consecutive nights. My family and I reside in a rural area with significant forested land. There's a modest body of water located roughly a few hundred meters from the edge of our property. I frequently take my youngsters down there to go swimming. That was the case until last week. Now I will never permit them to go there again. I haven't shared this experience with anyone, fearing I will sound irrational. It was last Saturday. We made our way to the water's edge and arranged our seating on the sandy area. It feels like our own secluded stretch of beach right beside our own property. It had always been wonderful. My partner and I relaxed in our beach chairs, enjoying the sunlight, while our kids played enthusiastically in the water. I always remind them not to venture too far into the deeper section. They are still relatively young, aged around 7 and 9. We remained there for a couple of hours that day. Neither of us felt inclined to enter the water ourselves. Eventually, my partner grew tired and decided to head back to the house. I agreed to stay with the children a while longer, as they were still having such immense fun splashing and playing on the sand. The sun was beginning to descend at this point. I was also starting to feel weary. The children were venturing slightly too far out, so I called to them to return closer to the edge. They didn't seem to hear me, apparently, so I stood up and moved closer to the water. Before I could call out to them again, I noticed something in the water. It appeared to be a dark, somewhat rounded object, and it was moving closer to where my children were playing. I ran into the water towards my kids, urging them to come back. When they were near enough, I pulled them out of the water myself. When I turned back towards the water, the object was gone. My children were completely perplexed. I didn't know what to tell them, so I simply informed them it was time to return home. We gathered our belongings and walked back to the house, but I wasn't feeling right. When we arrived, I felt uncomfortable about what I had just witnessed. That entity looked unlike any known aquatic creature. Our evening meal was prepared and waiting for us when we got back. I ate very slowly, preoccupied with thoughts of the object in the water and debating whether or not to confide in my partner. My partner asked me what was troubling me. She had noticed my slow eating pace. I decided against telling her at that moment. After dinner, I took a strong portable light source with me and walked back down to the water's edge. By then it was already dark outside. I reached the lake, but honestly I wasn't even sure what I expected to discover. I swept the beam of the light across the surface of the water, searching for the dark object. Just then I heard a significant disturbance coming from somewhere within the water, the kind of sound made by something large emerging from below the surface. I initially thought it might be some kind of animal native to the lake. I directed the light beam everywhere, searching for the origin of the sound. And then I located it, and I realized how terribly mistaken I had been. There was the shape of a figure resembling a human with extensive dark hair obscuring its entire face. It simply stood there, facing in my direction, but not seemingly looking directly at me, at least not that I could tell. I dropped the light source in terror and ran full speed back to my house, slamming the entrance door shut behind me. I haven't told anyone about this experience. What truly bothers me is that that body of water is only located a few hundred meters from our home. And for all I know, that entity could be observing me through my window right now. As I document this account,